So I think we can start tonight's talk. The talk tonight is going to be on the life of the Buddha and the Buddha himself as a person. And I remember when I recently went to India. It's not that recent anymore. It's about almost a year ago now. And one of the things that you talk about when you go to India, you talk about the life of the Buddha, because you go to the places where he was 2,500 years ago. And it's natural when you go to those places that you focus on who the Buddha actually was. And what you find out very quickly when you start talking about the Buddha is how little most people actually understand about who the Buddha was, what he actually did. And for that reason, it's actually a very useful way of coming to greater understanding of the Buddha just by talking about this. And I remember myself, I was also surprised when I started reading in more detail in the sutras about who the Buddha was. I also had often wrong ideas about who he actually was. But sometimes you have to go through the discourses of the Buddha with a very fine comb to actually realize who he was and to gain this greater appreciation of this historical figure who lived in India 2,500 years ago. And there are many advantages of talking about the Buddha. Many things, many ways this can actually enhance our practice of Buddhism. It can help us in many ways. And the first one is simply that, as I said before, many people have a very distorted perception of actually who the Buddha was. Very often the stories that we read about the Buddha, they are often not very reliable, unfortunately. Often they are based on late works of the Buddhist tradition, works that happened a long, long time after the Buddha, and they are much more legend and mythology than they actually are history of who the Buddha was. And because of that, the legend and mythology, by definition, is something which tends to be inflated. It tends to be changed. It's not really a reliable historical record. A legend or a myth, there can be maybe a core of truth to these kind of myths and legends, but a large part of it is going to be a distortion of what actually happened. So to understand who the Buddha was, we have to go back to the Buddha's own discourses, what he said 2,500 years ago, and only then can we get a reasonable appreciation of what he was and what the Dhamma was all about in relation to his life. And one reason for doing this is that it tends to actually give rise to a lot of trust and confidence and faith in the Buddha's teachings. Because I have found in my own life, I've always had a little bit of historical interest in these matters. And the more I understand of the Buddha, who he was, what he did 2,500 years ago, the closer, in a sense, it comes to me. The closer, the more real he becomes, and the more alive also becomes the Dhamma that he taught. It's almost like you get a relationship with the Buddha when you understand more of what type of personality and why he did the things he did, and why he taught the Dhamma in the way that he actually taught that Dhamma. So it gives, for me at least, and I think it's probably the same for many of you, it gives rise to so much more powerful faith, trust, confidence that this is the right thing here. The greater your understanding is, the more powerful these things tend to become. And also, one of the results of this kind of inquiry, I can probably tell you the results straight away because it's very mundane and very ordinary. One of the results of inquiring into the Buddha, who the Buddha was, that you realize that in most ways, in many, many ways, the Buddha was very much an ordinary human being, just like the rest of us. He had his defilements, he had his problems, just like us. And that's precisely because the Buddha was in many ways just like us. That is why his life is so significant for us. That is why we can relate to him as a person. That's why we can use his life as a kind of guiding light in our own practice. That's why we can understand what he was doing, and he could understand us. If the Buddha was some kind of God, if the Buddha was some kind of otherworldly being, which has absolutely no relationship to humanity, well then his life is no guide to us anymore, because it becomes something completely separate. There's no relationship between us and the Buddha anymore, because he's something else, he's something other. But if the Buddha is one of us, he's a human being, then suddenly his life becomes tremendously significant, because we can relate to him almost perfectly. And his life can become a guiding principle for also how we can also live our life as Buddhists and practice towards awakening, which obviously was the Buddha's own goal. And when you start to read the discourses of the Buddha, you realize that the Buddha often talked about his own life. He mentioned how he practiced, he mentioned what he did, he mentioned how he overcame problems in his meditation practice. All of these things he actually talks about. And there's a reason for that, obviously. The reason is to inspire the monks around him, to inspire the people, to show them how they also should practice. If the Buddha was not an ordinary human being, there wouldn't be much point in talking about his own life, because we would not be able to relate to it. It wouldn't make any sense for us. It wouldn't have any relevance in our own life anymore if the Buddha was completely different from us. So this is one of the beautiful things that come out. We can find so much inspiration in the Buddha's life by realizing that essentially he is one of us, a human being. Now that also, another way we can use that, there's a well-known meditation method that was taught by the Buddha. It's called Buddhanusati, which means recollection of the Buddha in the Pali language. And this is to remember who the Buddha was, remember his qualities, remember those marvelous qualities that one human being was able to break through this ignorance, this darkness in the world, and see things clearly for the first time. And this recollection is used very often to bring up a sense of joy and happiness in the meditation practice. So by talking about the life of the Buddha, we're improving our ability to do this recollection of the Buddha, to understand who the Buddha was, and to actually help us in our meditation practice. Because very often the most difficult part in meditation is often to get it started. And then when it gets started, then it tends to roll on much more easily by itself. So these are the reasons why I want to talk about this. Now when we talk about the Buddha, the first question that I like to ask is, who was this being that was born into the world 2,500 years ago, and who was to become the Buddha? We can call this person maybe the Buddha to be. That might be the best. We can't really call him the Buddha yet, because obviously he wasn't enlightened yet at birth, he wasn't awakened yet. Let's call him the Buddha to be. Who was this person who was born 2,500 years ago? And of course, from a Buddhist point of view, to understand this, you have to go into the past lives. Because the past lives, they are the things which form a person into what they are in the present life. So if we understand who the Buddha was in his past lives, then we can understand who this person was who was born into the present life. Now the Buddha taught a number of discourses where he actually talked about his past life experiences, about who he was, how he practiced, what he did in those past lives. And these are the most reliable records of the Buddha's past lives that we can have. There's enormous numbers of much more unreliable records, things which are much later, stories, myths, legends, all these kind of things, which we cannot really know whether they are true or not. But these things that were taught by the Buddha himself, this is the most reliable record we have, presumably, of who the Buddha was before he got born into the present existence 2,500 years ago. And some of those stories, in my opinion, are very revealing. One of these stories, this is a very, very simple story, and it's precisely, in my opinion, the simplicity of these stories which make them have a feel of authenticity about them. Because if something is simple, you don't normally go around praising your own